Um, but instead of teaching a class or a particular topic or a course this year, I wanted to sort of do this sort of fishbowl, or sort of more of a reverse fishbowl, where I'm sort of swimming around in the bowl, and you guys can question me, ask me about any of my thoughts, whether it was to do with the keynote I gave today, whether it's about this thing behind me called the flow system, whether it's about any of the things I've spoken about and taught over the last few years, be that Scrum the Toyota way, or the stuff I've shown at Lisbon in past years, or anything else for that matter that's sort of on your mind that you think I might be able to give an opinion on, be able to help you with. Or maybe you can teach me something. That would be really useful if I can learn from you. So that's the purpose of this. Of course, doing it with everybody on mute with no video, with one exception of Dominic, that's going to be really, really challenging. But as I say, I'm keeping my eye on I have the other laptop here, so I'm keeping my eye on what's happening in the main conference. And I do know who the special guest is, and you may all be excited to go listen to the special guest. No, so anyway, that's my intention for this, is that I'm now at your mercy for you to ask me questions or fire things at me, or even challenge me on some of the things that I've spoken about, maybe some of the things I mentioned this morning in my talk, or anything else that I'm known for, to challenge me on some of those opinions and to get me to support them, justify them, or explain them a little bit more. Or maybe you've just got challenges in the organizations that you're working in or working with, and you want some help. So it's really an open forum for you to take me in whatever direction you want, and hopefully I'll survive. So that's the intent, that's the idea. We can open with something. I guess there's only a few of us in the room, so why don't we just all sort of say hello to each other? I don't know. Let's go. I'm looking at Ricardo. He's got a picture of San Francisco behind him. Are you in San Francisco, Ricardo?
Hello. Yeah, this is the view from my window. So as you can see.
Fantastic.
No, I'm in Lisbon, actually.
Okay, awesome. Where you from? I mean, you're in Lisbon. Are you sort of representing a certain organization, or have you got certain interests in this conversation?
Yeah, so I work at Miniclip as Scrum Master. And for this conversation, I'm just looking forward to any questions that might come up.
Cool.
And let's see if I even have my own to ask. So let's see how it goes.
Jessica's next to you on my screen, and that's my daughter's name, so I'm just going to pick her to say hello to, and let Jessica say hello to everybody else in the room.
Hello, I'm Jessica. I'm also a Scrum Master at Miniclip. I work with Ricardo in Lisbon. I was very interested in your presentation earlier, so I changed my workshop for yours. I don't really have any questions right now, but we'll see.
That's okay. I'm going to go to Lindy next, because she's right next to you on my screen.
Hi there. I'm from Glasgow, and I am new to Agile. I am very late to the party with this one. I work in digital learning and development, and Agile methodology is really new within learning and development that I know of. I don't know anyone else that's worked to Agile, because it's very much a waterfall system. However, I'm part of development and engineering. We're now starting to work to Agile models, so therefore my team need to be able to adapt to that. And one of the things that really struck me with your presentation earlier was the focus at the end on the behaviours. And one of my challenges is actually to create a competency matrix for a competency framework for my team, which I'm hoping to base it along the lines of the company values, and also fitting in the Agile values along with that, and the behaviours and the value outputs, rather than your traditional competency matrix. So I'm really just on to hear what everyone else's experience is.
Well, no, I mean, that's awesome, Lindy, and it's great to hear such a lovely Scottish accent as well. So, and I'll translate the Glaswegian for everybody else.
Sorry.
So that's fine. But I'll get into some examples, and I've got some templates I can send you actually, which will be really useful and helpful to you, because if you're in learning and that sort of side of things, things like self-based sort of assessment, self-paced correction and self-based assessment, but also things like behavioral factors and behavioral markers. These are some of the key things that you can start to use. And I'll show you some of those. I just want to let you know that Jeff Sutherland's presenting. I don't know if anybody wants to watch Jeff Sutherland. I used to work for Jeff, so I've heard everything that Jeff has to say. But if you want to see him, he's presenting at the moment in the main room, and he's talking Scrum at Scale. So I helped him develop some of these things. So if you want to talk Scrum at Scale, I can fill in the blanks. But if you want to hear Jeff, he's talking right now at the moment. I want to go right above you, Lindy, to Dominic, or is it Dominique? So, and let him say hello to everybody, because this is only a few of us. It will just make it friendly. Dominic.
Hello to all. I'm Dominic. I'm working in Paris on big transformation program, including agile transformation. And I'm more interested about how organizations adapt than a specific agile framework.
So that's
and I was interested about your flow system.
Okay, well, I'll fill in some of the blanks.
There's some resonance with this.
It'll start to make sense to quite a few of you. And actually, you have my deepest sympathy and greatest admiration working in transformation in France. I used to live in Belgium. I used to do a lot of work for Euroclear, and I spent a lot of time in Paris. I lived in Paris in the 16th at one point, and the challenges of correcting the behaviors of our French colleagues is very challenging. So you have my
we launched a work. I had someone working on a thesis, research thesis, for the last 4 years about how you generalize agility in an organization.
Oh dear.
And it was quite interesting because we worked with Central Bank, Banque de France, with Amadeus, with energy company, with a big bank, Société Générale, and so forth. And it was quite interesting because we got a lot of data and some patterns became to emerge. And when we started that 4 years ago, there was almost no studies, no research studies, and very little on the practical, except scaling at big projects, but not about generalizing and the impact on the organization. Now, since 1 year or two, you begin to see things about the impact on the organization and not only doing big project at scale, which is different.
Sure, sure. I want to quickly jump down to the bottom of the screen because I want to ask a couple of other people have joined to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get into some nice content. But Dominic, when you talk about generalizing an agile approach, I know this is being recorded, so I can only imagine people throwing things at me in the future, but just use SAFE if you want a generalized approach to agile. It won't work, but use it anyway, and that will help you. I'll come back.
Just to be more precise, generalizing agile practice on IT project and the impact of this on the organization, not using agile on everything.
Yeah, I know. I understand. Philippe, you're down on my screen. I just wanted to say hello to you and welcome you, and just let you say hello to everybody else.
Hi, everyone. I have been a Scrum Master for 6 months now, and I work at Mercedes-Benz IO. And yeah, I don't have any questions, but I liked your presentation, so I choose this workshop.
You're very, very kind. Diogo, is it Diego or Diogo?
Diogo, it's Diogo.
Diogo.
Hello, everyone. I'm from Lisbon also, but I have a peculiar background. I am a pharmacist, and I worked 8 years in the pharma industry in a Lean and Six Sigma, in manufacturing, Lean and Six Sigma project as a black belt. And I found very interesting in the Agile project management. And I changed to Average, and right now I'm a Scrum Master and Agile coach at Santander. So I found you very interesting, Nigel, because I have all the Lean and background, and I started working in Agile. And I'm a pharmacist, so I don't know anything about software development or banking, but I'm a very successful Scrum Master and Agile coach here in Santander and Digit and Agile Transformation Project. And I agree, because it's all about people, and it's all about the values and the core values that you have, and you don't need that you need the background that I had in Lean and Six Sigma and in manufacturing gave me the agility that I needed to implement in the teams and in software or banking. So I'm eager to find out a little more about the full system and the DNA of organizations, because I have some of your background, starting with Six Sigma and Lean and manufacturing and operations, and then go to Agile and Scrum in the software, digital, and now in the digital area.
That's really interesting, and I'll get into that, because I mean, Lindy was saying she's late to the sort of Agile party, so we'll sort of, I'll try and join a few of those dots. And the whole thing, when I created the thing called Scrum the Toyota Way, which was really a play on words, which was sort of illustrating what lean and the sort of, you know, Toyota background, but the lean industry really meant, what lean thinking was, and where Six Sigma fitted, or some people sometimes call it sick stigma, but I'll get into why that is in the future. But then the sort of Agile world, and really it wasn't one or the other. As you've seen with a lot of people who are talking now, it's very complementary. And I'm actually working with a large bank at the moment. There's only one thing worse than banks, and that's politics. So when government, then banks, then sort of, you know, other financial institutions like insurance companies are usually very challenging to deal with. But just I mean, for those that have got cameras on, there's only a few of us, and I know there's a couple of people dropping in and out, and as they decide whether they want to hang around and stay. And you can leave at any time. Don't feel obliged to hang around and listen to me ramble if it's not useful to you. But just from a show of hands, who's sort of familiar with lean and lean thinking, Toyota production system, that type of thing? Yeah. So there's about four of, well, if you include me, that's about four of us. And who's sort of, you know, and we've got some Scrum Masters. So I'm going to, just from a show of hands, who's sort of, you know, had at least a year or two in the Agile Scrum sort of universe. So that's everybody but Lindy. That's all right, Lindy. You've got a room of experts here. This is brilliant for you. So that's really good. So who wants to tell? I mean, you can ask me any questions you want, and at any time ask me questions. But let me just ask you, who wants to tell me in a sentence or two what lean, actually summarize lean for me? For those that aren't really from the lean background, how would you summarize lean? And whoever wants to speak first can do, but how do you summarize lean for those that aren't familiar? I'll give you my opinion afterwards. Room's gone silent, look.
I think it's maximizing value, or at least minimize waste. That sounds like the same thing, but it's not.
So when we talk about, I was talking to a Spanish speaking audience the other day, and I don't speak Spanish, or very minimal words, but in Spanish, I'm told there's no such, the only meaning for waste is trash, rubbish. It doesn't have any other meaning. That, you know, like in English, when we talk about waste in business, we talk about non-value added activity. So let me show you a couple of things I showed, and this might stimulate the grey matter a little bit. I hope this will work. Let me see if I can show you the right slides here, because I do have some challenges occasionally with my friend Zoom when I've got multiple slide decks open. Well, let's just jump back into, let's see if this will work. You're looking at my screen now, so let me spin that around. Okay. Somebody tell me they can see. Let me just get rid of this. I'm going to do it this way because it'll be a lot easier for me to show you it this way. Let me just turn off the navigator and turn off the presenter's notes, and then I can show you. All right. So Let me just make sure. You can all see this, yeah?
Yes.
Good, good. I just want to make sure. So that, look, for those that aren't familiar, the origins of lean came from Toyota's production system, and not a lot of people realize that actually the sort of pillars of Toyota's production system predate Toyota's production system. So Sakichi Toyota down the bottom left, he came up with this concept of Jidoka, which really just means automation with the human touch, not removing the humans from the process. And the key precepts of that, or the key sort of focus of that, is quality. And then his son, Kichiro Toyota, who's the guy who actually started the Toyota Motor Car Company, or the Toyota Motor Corporation, he developed what he considered just in time, which is, of course, the basis of all lean and agile practices. And I'll qualify that for Lindy in a few moments about the agile side. And then if you look down the bottom, the first principles were customer first. 1946, they wrote the customer first promise, the year at the end of World War II from a Japanese perspective, when Japan was devastated, but their focus was always the customer. Then this deep respect for humanity, which goes beyond respect for people. And then this thing, eliminate waste. This is the core sort of foundational pieces. And then our friends, if I scroll down a bit, oh, of course, I'm not in presenter mode, so I'm going to have to use my navigator. I'm sorry about this, folks. And I'll do this because it'll just make it easy for me to navigate for you guys. And then in 91, MIT did a 5-year study into the motor manufacturing, automotive manufacturing business. And Jim Womack and Dan Jones sort of wrote the book, The Machine That Changed the World. And then the follow-up book, Lean Thinking, and created the Lean Enterprise Institute. And it was this guy, John Krafkick, who was the CEO of Waymo, that actually came up with the word lean. So the word lean came out of a paper or a discussion they were having about a presentation they were going to give about the work they'd done, and they needed a label to describe Toyota's management system. And they came up with the word lean. And it was this guy who's now, as I say, the CEO of Google's autonomous driving division. He was at the time a graduate researcher working for Jim Womack at the time MIT was doing the study. And then, Diogo, as you were saying, the key focus, and Ono said this about TPS, was elimination of waste, the elimination of all waste. And they categorized waste into these different categories. This underutilization of talent was actually added later by lean practitioners. This wasn't something that Ono had said originally. And the way I summarized this the other day for the bank I was talking to, it's anything that is non-value added activity. So anything that doesn't add value. And the problem is when we get into business and people start thinking about manufacturing, they get a little confused. And so inventory is one of those wastes, one of those non-value added activities. And as you can see, there's some examples of inventory on the screen, and the 2 iPhone screenshots here are real. These are not made up. These are real. The others were just Google shots that I put in just to illustrate the concept. And this was a manager who worked for me, and bless her, she did improve when she learned some of the lean thinking, but that was her desk probably about 18 months ago when I came across her at one time working in one of our Toyota buildings. And then you go on to waiting, of course, which is anything that involves unnecessary queuing, waiting in line, or these hellish phone answering systems that have you pressing buttons dementedly trying to find somebody. Transportation, the movement of any unnecessary movement of any products, materials, information, and of course now transportation of people has ceased with this new global world of Zoom. And then we go into motion, which is unnecessary movement of people or machines or processes. But the thing that really kills me is this walking to these departmental printers. One of the worst things they ever did was implement these printers where everybody has to go to a central printing point. The amount of waste just by using these printers is insane. And actually, you've eliminated that with everybody working at home. We just increased the email usage. Overproduction, producing more than is needed or is required at the time it's needed. And then over processing, too many signatures, too many handoffs, too much interference from management, and too many people wanting fingers in the pie. And of course, things like hideous spreadsheets. We come across these all the time, which require just far too much processing to use. Defects and rework, while defects and rework are a reality, we want to try and avoid them as much as possible, because adding any form of rework is not value added. And then, of course, context switching. This is one that I've talked about a lot, and some of you will be very familiar with. If you're working on one thing at a time and you're fully focused on that one thing, then of course you are 100% focused. But if you're, I don't think you guys can see me, if you're texting and driving, then unfortunately you're only looking at the road 40% of the time, and the other 40% at your phone, and 20% of the time you're switching cognition as you're trying to figure out what you should be looking at. The challenge is when you get into running 4 or 5 projects, initiatives, products, whatever it is, your fingers are in many pies, you start to find that you're losing as much as 75% of your focus by doing that. And a good example of that is meetings when we used to be in the physical space most of the time, which is when you're staring at computers and tapping on things when you should be participating and engaged in a meeting or a discussion. And of course, when you're in a meeting and a discussion and you're updating your Facebook feed or whatever else. So the key is to stop doing unnecessary things and to challenge. Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean we always should. Just because there's a policy, a process, an approach in place doesn't mean we should just continue to do it that way. And part of lean thinking is to continuously challenge that. Otherwise, we're just underutilizing talent. The other thing that I'll mention before I come back to you guys is that when we talk about flow, flow is continuous value-added activity. I have some slides somewhere I can show you on this to sort of illustrate it. But essentially, companies are created vertically in these silos. This is a banking example. Lots of different departments, teams within those departments, hierarchies of structure, all going up to some sort of divisional departmental director or vice president. But the actual way companies work is horizontally. They're designed vertically, but value flows horizontally. And this is one of the key concepts behind the flow system, is that we want to optimize for flow of value. And one of the key ways we get rid of that, of course, is eliminating all the handoffs between organizational units. Now, let me just stop there and come back to you. More people have joined. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of lean thinking, because I know this thing's small behind me, especially on this screen, but I will put a slide up of it in a short while. The foundation of this is built off lean thinking. So a lot of people describe lean thinking as systems thinking, and a lot of system thinkers get all irate about what is a system and what isn't a system. But basically, where you've got 2 or more things interacting, it's a system. And if one thing is impacting another thing in some way, you're in a systems thinking world. So we wanted to pivot off this lean thinking, this systems thinking, before we started to build upon that. And the key principles of this were customer first focus, the flow of value, which is the whole customer first principle anyway, which all the agile practitioners now tell the world. And we heard Joe talking about customer first in his presentation. So that's my sort of canned piece about lean. Now I've had a little say. Who would like to explain to Lindy the key concepts of agility? Because she said she's new to this agile world, and you've got a bunch of agile experts in this room, or practitioners if you don't like to be called experts. Who would like to have a go at giving her a short description of agile? And I'll key up some slides in the background while you do that. Oh, it's so noisy in that room.
I always like to use like doing the product right, and agile doing the right product. Okay, like maximizing the value that it delivers, so with the minimum scope possible.
Why would be? Let me ask you a question. Why would it be the minimum scope possible?
That's agility. Delivering.
Think about it in a lean context. Not just Diogo, anybody. Yeah, Moss, please jump in.
Just if you're thinking about in inventory as a non-value added activity, if you have a lot of stuff either sitting right behind you to work on, or things that are in progress, that's all kind of waiting, or inventory that's stacked up in your working area that you really don't need. So if you're working on just a few things at a time, that reduces your inventory. So minimizing work in progress. I forgot the original part of the question, but
No, that's fine. I mean, it was more of basically the concept of agility, but then Diogo was saying about, you know, doing it with the minimum amount of scope, and my sort of reflection was, well, why the minimum amount of scope? And that was a great answer, Moss, because lean thinking is really about eliminating anything that's non-value added. So if you're working with a customer, and you hear all agile speakers, and Joe, just before we started this workshop, and many of the other speakers over the last few days have all talked about this customer focus, engaging the customer, participating with the customer, and there's different ways to do that. But the reality of it is, and I have slides that say this, but essentially lean is about building the product right. So the sort of whole focus on Jidoka, which is building quality in, building this product that is built to very high standards, very high quality. And of course, Toyota is the sort of pinnacle of that, as the world obviously focuses on them. But then when agility comes in, it's building the right product. So you want to build the product right, but we need to build the right product. Well, this constant engagement and conversation with the customer enables us to only build the features, capabilities, and techniques, whatever, within the product that the customer actually wants, needs, or desires. So as Moss says, we're eliminating that inventory, because a backlog is inventory. So in the old days of project management, and you know, I don't have a problem with people calling things projects or initiatives, I really don't. But in the old days, or in the previous days, and I came from project management, our requirements were pre-baked. It was this inventory of stuff, and now we had to go do all this inventory, and until the inventory was fully processed, the project wasn't over. The difference is now is that we start with some semblance of an idea of what we're going to build. Trust me, you're not going to start any type of initiative without some idea of what you're going to do. So there's going to be some initial inventory there. Call that a backlog, call it user stories, call it product backlog items, whatever you want to call it, even call it requirements. There's no law says you can't call those requirements, by the way. And then you start to implement things, and you start to talk to the customer and demonstrate what's been shown. And again, I'm referring to Joe just because he came just before this workshop, is that even in the hardware world, they're building something they can show to a customer or test on their customer's device. And he was showing trains and other type of equipment, and they get feedback. And that emergent learning, and that's the key here, agility is emergent. You don't ever do agility. People still, even some of the big speakers and trainers, talk about doing agile, and that's a horrendous phrase, because agility is an emergent property. It's how we interact, how we behave, how we deliver value, and we become agile because we become more flexible, more adaptable, and these are all things that emerge from the way we work. And so my sort of key for agility is really building the right thing. I don't know if anybody's got any additional comments that not just will help Lindy, but anybody else who's joining subsequently. Thoughts, ideas? Fantastic book, Moss. Fantastic book.
I was going to say one thing that really helped me understand just the whole agile process was this book. This is Lean, because it talks about how for example, when you go to see the doctor, they're optimizing for the doctor, so the doctor is never waiting. And that's one of the things, was waiting as a non-value added activity. But really, the thing that you want to optimize is so that the patient is never waiting, so you get more throughput for the patient rather than for the doctor. So it might be talking about a way to balance between, maybe if the doctor waits a little bit, but the patient can see everybody much sooner, that they get better care. So that's kind of like focusing on the customer care or the customer oriented solution rather than optimizing for your doctor. And then taking
Yeah,
that, they extend that all to the, you know, programming or development or whatever.
it's funny you mention that, because the medical industry is not optimized for the patient, which is something that we struggle with in the States, of course. For those that, if anybody else is from the US, I know that Ricardo said he was pretending to be in San Francisco there. But no, I'm learning that the healthcare system is optimized for the insurance companies and for the medical industry, not for the patient. If any of you after this want to join the Slack channel, just send me a message. Either I'll give you my email on this, or you can do it through the Experience Agile Slack channel, because if anybody's interested in the medical industry, I do have some in the Flow System Slack group. We have some medical industry experts who are really working heavily in lean healthcare. So there's some really clever learning from some pretty brilliant people there. So we've sort of summarized this idea of agility is that we want to deliver the right thing at the right time. And this lean thinking helps us eliminate all the non-value added activity and build in the right value. Who wants to have a crack at what value is? And then I'll start talking more about this thing behind me, and and as you guys come up with questions, either wave at me frantically or use one of the reactions. I guess the only reaction we've got down here, you could use the thumbs up if you want to ask a question. You can use the clappy hands if you like what's been said. But so who wants to have a stab at what we mean by value? Because we've said eliminate non-value added activity. I sort of talked a little bit about the flow of value. We talked about lean, eliminating all this stuff, and we talked about agility, ensuring we're focused on building the right thing, which would be building the right value, I assume. But who wants to have a stab at what value really is? Lindy, awesome. Yeah, you have to press that mute thing.
Yeah, I couldn't find the unmute button for some reason.
That's
I think value to me is something that's going to have the biggest impact and make the biggest positive impact, whether it's for your customers, well, essentially, yeah, for your customers, but maybe even for something that's going to be saving you so much money or time or effort. To me, it's what's going to have that biggest positive impact.
You know, an interesting point there, because you mentioned the customer or whoever. Somebody, I mean, just as a tangent, who can define a customer? Ooh, that's a hard one, you see.
Anyone you interact with.
Yeah, I've got some material on this. No, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I just worry about the term customer, because sometimes you're not selling something to somebody. So sometimes it's not necessarily a customer that you're maximizing, which I think comes back to the medical industry issue, that you're not really trying to maximize revenue. Ideally, you're trying to minimize loss of life. Maybe in that case, value would be anything that you do to minimize loss of life.
Yeah, I think in a non-profit, certainly in a situation like that, the definition of customer is always somewhat challenging. Any other thoughts on value? And then I'll tell you what my thoughts are.
I used to define value for project, program, or whatever initiative at the strategic level first, why you are launching the initiative. And I think it exists a long time before Agile came about. It's not specific to Agile, but I think the Agile different framework and talks about value, OKRs, and like it's like if doing Agile is defining value, and before we were not defining value, which is, I think, very awkward. But what's sure is that by trying to speak about value, for example, you speak about Scrum, they say that you have to define the value of the different user stories. But most of the time, you find teams who are optimizing value of their backlog and trying to prioritize their backlog without thinking about how it maps with the value while you launch the project. You have the value of the initiative, and you have a value you create benefit, value, ROI, whatever, of the different elements. And you have to make sense, they should be mapped, synchronized, aligned. And most of the times they're not aligned.
There's a surprise. So let me give you some thoughts. Let me see if I can make this darn thing work as I want it to do. Let me just make sure I've got the right thing on my, here we go, on my screen. Let's see if this will actually present. Oh, look at that. That might present proper. Let's see if I can just drag that down and hit that button. Why is that not working? All right. I have to, give me a second. I have a problem with the Keynote. If I have too many keynotes open at the same time, it will only show you one full screen. So let me just close down one or two of these, and that should now hopefully work full screen. Hallelujah. There we go. So, and I can see some of you on screen at the same time, which is good. So this is how the industry, and when I talk about the industry, I'm talking about the Lean and Six Sigma world, define value. And I'll give you some interpretations. Any activity that adds value to a product or service by being processed. So if you're creating some sort of product or service and the activity is adding value to it, then of course it's value added. Activity that physically changes the product or service by being processed. So if you're working on a device or you're working on something and it's actually changing it in a key way, then that's considered value added. The activity the customer cares or is willing to pay for. So assuming they understood what you were doing and why you were doing it, and they cared or were willing to offer funding for that, then that would be considered valuable. And of course, it's done the right first time. We talked about defects and rework a few moments ago. But I coined a phrase some time ago in a conversation: value is only valuable if someone values your value. So whether it's a non-profit, see, if you're a non-profit, let's say you're a wonderful non-profit doing all sorts of charitable missions around the world, helping people, you're only valuable while the people receiving the charitable support perceive you're valuable. So even in a non-profit, the perception of value comes from those you serve. In a revenue generating, a for-profit organization, it comes from the people who give you money. So value is only valuable if someone values your value. It doesn't matter. You know, everybody remember the Nokia case study. We may even talk about that. So here we've got sort of unarticulated need. Unarticulated need is need that the customer hasn't yet expressed. And sometimes, I know Jeff Sutherland used to refer to this as Humphrey's Law, which is people don't know what they need until they get it. But in the majority of cases, people know what they want and know what they value. But unarticulated need is trying to understand the elements that the customer hasn't yet articulated. This is part of a presentation I gave to the bank the other day with a partner of mine, and we talked about optimizing the organization for value flow. And this won't work so well, but movement is not flow. Okay, so just because stuff's moving around, work, products, people, emails, paperwork in a system, some workflow in some hideous Oracle or ERP system, that's not value just because stuff is moving around. Value is actually defined as continuous value. Sorry, flow is actually defined as continuous value-added activity. So if you're trying to establish flow, and people think about flow as one-piece flow in Toyota, and that doesn't mean you work on one thing at once. It just means there's a continuous flow of work. And the production line was actually, the moving production line was invented by Ford. And the purpose of it wasn't just to have the vehicle moving along a line. The purpose was to facilitate continuous value-added activity. As the car moved, before the moving production line, I have a photo of this somewhere, but before the moving production line, the vehicle would be static. And people would come and do work on it, and then those people would go away and other people would come and do work on it. There's all this excessive motion and movement of people and materials, and obviously a lot of waiting, because these people were waiting for the previous folks to get out of the way so they could do their bit. But once the moving production line became a reality, the car could move along and be gradually assembled on a continuous basis. And that was what really defined continuous value-added activity, and that is flow, the seamless transition, as I wrote here, from ideas or ideation to the delivery of value. So this is what you've got to keep in your mind. And actually your lean thinking is much more important in an agile world than your agile thinking, knowing how to do Scrum or something else. Much more important. I'll use that. Yeah. So some of the things that I threw at the bank the other day is remove unneeded scope and sort of features, which is, and you do that by talking to your customers. So that's your agile piece. You're combining lean here by removing inventory and unnecessary work by talking to the people who actually perceive your value. So it's the value that's perceived in you. Because we start to remove bottlenecks, and we can use tools like Kanban and others. But I want to tell you something here. There's no such thing as a Kanban board. It's all made up by people who come up with fake universities. It's actually called an and-on display. And-on is sort of the visualization of the work within Toyota. Kanban is just the tool that allows us to deliver just-in-time working. And Kanban is a series of cards that allow us to control flow of inventory. And the little post-it notes you see on these boards here, then they can be considered Kanban cards, but the board is actually an and-on display. I'm just being a bit sort of particular about that, just for a bit of fun. If you want to mess with some of your colleagues, let's come out of that.
I do the same, Nigel. I do exactly the same about Kanban.
So I wrote an article about, and you saw in my presentation, there's no such thing about, Kanban is not a methodology, a team, or a board, yeah? Because it just aggravates me. People teach, I'm a PST, and we have a class called Professional Scrum with Kanban, and I actually spoke to the guys writing the PSK guide a few weeks ago and gave them some suggestions for improvement, some inputs there to say to that. So let me just jump through into one other little area I want to show you, because let's just talk about this whole thing about agility, just to wrap this up for anybody's my opinions on this. Then we'll get a little bit more into flow. But let me just talk a little bit about agility. So Craig Larman, a lot of you know Craig. He spoke at last year's Experience Agile, and he's somebody I've known over the years, and he and I bump into each other occasionally and have a few giggles and conversations. He wrote a paper for the IEEE Computing Society that uncovered that this agile way of working was actually happening in the 1950s in mainframe programming in the USA. So agile is not a new idea. And if anybody watched my talk I recorded earlier for Experience Agile this morning, or the afternoon in Lisbon, this morning for me, we can see that a lot of these techniques have been around for decades, whether it's agile software development in the 50s, Deming with his product design life cycle from the 50s, all from the 50s, you see, all this emerged after the World War II, when MacArthur sent in Protzman and Saracone and others into Japan to start dealing with the quality and management problems they got in Japanese business that have been devastated, of course, by the conflict. And then some of the things that came out of that formed the TQC, TQM movement. And then people like Duran and Deming and Stewart and all these others went. And it was actually Charlie Protzman's grandfather. Charlie's a friend of mine, and it was Charlie Protzman Sr. that took Deming to Japan, and the rest was history. So a lot of the things came out of those movements that then helped the Japanese business, and especially Toyota, formulate a lot of their thinking. And indeed, PDCA came out of the TQM movement, not from Deming initially. And that sort of entered Toyota in about, they think, around 1967. We're still trying to tie that down precisely. So a lot of this thinking came out of that world. So this sort of mindset isn't new, or this thinking isn't new. And of course, the famous Nokia case is the example of how not to be agile, which is where you're following your 5-year business plan, and we're too big to change. And as one of the quotes says on that slide, if we made a mistake, somebody's head would roll. And Nokia went from being the largest cell phone company on the planet, 52% of the global sales, to being zero in 5 years. Now they're a networking company. They still exist as a different entity now. And I think they just won some of the 5G business in the UK because they just kicked out Huawei, the Chinese company, because of all the politicking and security issues there. And so, but this is how not to be agile, just to ignore what your customer wants. And Nokia famously said, as did BlackBerry, nobody would want a phone without a real keypad on it. Somebody made a mistake there. So, and then, so this, I drew this a long time ago to sort of say what agility really means. We've got this idea that, you know, this thing, what was imagined versus what was actually needed, you know, the sort of Porsche versus the minivan. I'm sorry, I'm all American nowadays. I've lived here for 10 years, so I don't call things, I don't even know what we call those things in the UK anymore, or in Europe. But we start off with some initial requirements, some initial idea, a backlog of something we want, some initial specifications, which are what we would have normally called the sort of the technical design documents back in the day. So we went from requirements to technical specifications. So the initial specs, we build something, we test it, and we show it to the customer, and we get some feedback, and then we continue those repetitive cycles. And the key is requirements and specifications are created and iterated as we build the product. And this phrase that I didn't coin, somebody else did, we maximize the amount of work not done. You see, that's your lean thinking. So I tell you, for anybody who's not a deep lean expert or lean thinking expert, spending a lot more time understanding the lean underpinnings will actually serve you much better. Scrum you can learn in a couple of hours, and, you know, many months to try and get to master it. And the reason it's hard to master is nothing to do with the process. It's to do with the human interactions and the people. And I'll dig into that a little bit in a few moments. And there's some nonsense there about what all that is. So we'll just stop that sharing for a minute. So that's, any questions so far? I mean, this has been a bit of a history lesson, a bit of a review for some of the people that asked, sort of indicated initially what they want to learn, and we'll go a bit dig deeper into the human side of things and into some of the concepts in the flow system.
I have one
Any
question.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Let's have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, so nowadays it's very usual to see companies moving to agile. Every now and then you are in a company, you look to the side, they are doing agile and it's working, so we need to do it as well. And it's really normal to see, okay, we are an agile company because our teams work with Scrum or whatever. But as we have seen before, it's really important that these role models and these behaviors come from the top. And sometimes it's not what is happening. So my question is, when you are inserted in one of these companies, where you have Scrum teams working in Agile, but the executive part of the company is not aligned on that mentality, how can we improve looking into a Scrum team, and how can we have this effect on the executive level to help them change as well?
I know. I wish I had a magical answer for you, and I really don't have a magical answer. There is no easy sort of method to that. If you don't have, so we can look at it in two ways. If you've got this giant global corporation, I used to work for Toyota until the end of last year, this giant global corporation, the big boss at the top, Akio Toyoda, who I never met, is the big boss. The chances of me, even in an executive role that I was in, talking to him and influencing him are almost zero. So what happens in a large organization, the organization is broken up into lots of unit sizes that are functional in themselves. So I worked full-time for an organization called Toyota Connected, which was a smaller division of a bigger Japanese parent company, not of Toyota Motor Corporation. Actually, it was part of Toyota Connected Japan. And whereas Toyota Motor North America is a separate company to Toyota Connected. But then I did work at Toyota Motor North America and at Toyota Financial Services and other Toyota affiliates. And when you go into Toyota Motor North America, there's about 110,000 people work for it. So it's not one chunk. You're never going to influence, you know, the CEO of TM&A to start talking about Scrum and Agile and Lean and all this other stuff. So what happens is you have to start looking at the business unit that you're within, because that's the sphere of your influence potentially. And there's typically a vice president, a general manager, some form of director of that business unit. And I could go off at a tangent talking about Dunbar's number and what that really means, and about breaking down units into organizations into manageable size units. But essentially what you've got to do is identify the leadership within that organization, that you're part of that ecosystem. The biggest part of influence I had actually at Toyota was to start and don't think that Toyota is this super lean and super slick organization globally. It's not. At the production line, they're the best in the world. But as you walk into sort of administration, into office, into procurement, vendor management, finance, away from making cars, then they have all the same problems that every other large organization has, that they've grown over the years, lots of bureaucracy and red tape and inefficient processes. So a lot of the organizational units are still learning and relearning the fundamentals of the company that it's based upon, this lean thinking. And the word lean is used in Toyota all the time. A lot of people who write about Toyota never put lean and Toyota production system together because they think one is sacrilege to the other, but actually inside this hallowed territory of Toyota, nobody cares. And they use these words interchangeably. So, you know, don't ever worry about people telling you, oh no, lean and TPS are different things. It's just silly politicking online. But essentially, within the organization, there are lots of inefficiencies in there. So what I started to do with Toyota, and I recommend this again, is when you start to look at a product delivery in an agile context, what you're actually looking at is a value stream. So if you're not familiar with value stream mapping and its better counterpart, value stream design, because making a map's great, helps you to see, but then you've got to design a value stream that actually delivers the value effectively, excuse me. And so what we started to do is we started to look, and I may have a slide on this. Let me just see if I've got a slide on this, because it may help the conversation as we're talking. Let me just see if I can find this. And if not, then I will use a different thing. Give me a second. Let me just bring up this one. I think it was in here from the other day, because let me just see. I talked about leadership a lot there. Go back the other way. I just like to give you a visual indication. Yeah, here we go. So, oh, I'll break everything. So, all right, let's start it from this point, because this will help you, I think. Let me just share this now. I've fixed everything on this computer. All right, let me just move that down and hit this button here. So we talked about optimizing for flow of value. So all a value stream is that horizontal flow of value. That's all it is. People think so. And you know, when you start to look at silos, they're everywhere. In non-English speaking countries, they call projects missions, hence the word missions. When I lived in Belgium, we call projects missions. I'm sure in Paris, Dominic's very familiar with the word mission. But teams even end up being silos, and even team members end up being silos. And silos are bad. Handoffs are bad. Queues are bad. All forms of batching and waiting are evil and bad. And we try to eliminate them all. It's actually impossible to eliminate them all for different reasons. But the way we start to learn to see them is to create a map, to visualize the world as it is. And we do that by using a technique called value stream mapping. For those that are familiar with it, this is old news. These are manufacturing type symbols, but that actually is a diagram of making a tuna sandwich. So you can use this technique for the most simple of processes. And if anybody wants these slides, or some of these slides I've been showing later, just ping me in the Slack channel, and I'll organize with Hugo and the gang to make these available as a download for you all. So basically a value stream map looks like very much like a process diagram, but there's a technique called linear contextualization. It's a really big mouthful of words, but basically it means go backwards. So if you read the seminal book on value stream mapping, it's a book called Learning to See. Again, I'll make sure I make this available if I don't bring it. It's called Learning to See. It's written by John Shook and Mike Rother, the people who Mike Rother of Toyota Kata fame. John Shook Lean Institute friend, good friend of mine. I know Mike quite well as well. But they talk about this, and linear contextualization says start at the end. Normally this slides in builds, but I just, for this benefit. So let's say this, my pink post-it note here is my product. I start here where I finish the product. This is the end when I'm delivering to my customer. And I work backwards from there. This is this linear contextualization. You contextualize it in this linear fashion, starting from the finished goods. And you say to yourself, what was the last thing I did just before it shipped to the customer? So at the end of your sprint, or when you actually pack it in a box and give it to the postman, or whatever the process is, what was the last thing you did? And you write another post-it note next to it. And on this post-it note, you write a name of a process that might be valuable or useful. You write down some information that might be valuable to the people participating in, so they understand what it means, what this box means. And in that, you write how long it took and whether you considered it was value added or non-value added. So a manager signing off is non-value added. It added no value to the product or service by being processed. But if you did something technically, physically, in other words, or regulatory that you had to do to this product, then that's considered value added. Now, we continue building that picture out, and we end up in, I've done this with teams in over a day, and we've ended up with walls that are, 10, 15 meters, 30, 40 feet wide, full of post-it notes with arrows going in all sorts of directions. And once we've actually identified that between each of these processes, of course, what we're doing is we're putting in the waiting time between each other. So this process finishes and it needs to go here, but it now goes into a queue where it waits until this next step is ready to pull that work in and actually execute. That's the basic concept for those that are unfamiliar with value stream mapping. There's lots of books written on this that are much better at me explaining it. Then you get to the ubiquitous Kanban board and on display, which you're all familiar with. And everybody thinks Kanban is this thing you need to take a 2-day course and pay $1,500 or your equivalent in euros or pounds. Don't waste your money. I'm going to teach you Kanban in about 2 minutes. It's all you'll ever need to know. This is all Kanban is. There's no mystery to it at all. So all that the Kanban technique is, and whether you go David Anderson's route or otherwise, doesn't really matter, is you have an intake. This is where it starts its life. Call it a backlog if you like. And then you have a process flow, which is that horizontal flow where the piece of work moves from one step to the next step. And even if you're doing Scrum or any other agile sort of pursuit, there's always a beginning and an end and a set of steps it goes through to get there. The fact that the team are all working together and all cross-functional, cross-skilled and helping each other is just a characteristic of team working and working much more rapidly than handing off to different departments around the building. And the idea of a Scrum team or an Agile team is you've removed the excess motion, the inventory and the handoffs because everybody's together and you can just pass work or discuss work and support each other. So you just eliminated a lot of that lean waste by working in that manner. That's one of the reasons that Scrum and Agile techniques work so well in that context. So as you start to go, and you see on this board, you can go from intake, waiting, design. When it's sat in that queue, then gets pulled by the design team. The design team do some work. They push it into the next queue where it waits until the next step in the process, in my example here, development are ready, and they pull it in. Those WIP limits down the bottom, known as work in progress limits, are their capacity limit. That's the maximum amount of activities, tasks, or work they can be performing at any one time. So when they reach that capacity, any new work for them sits in the queue and the queue builds up. And eventually you move along until you're in the done column. And the idea is to reduce the amount of time it takes to get across that board. No, not colloquially as cycle time. There's lots of other times, but that's the average, the normal thing. Now, as you start to look at this board, I just mapped for fun a bit of waste on here. All forms of batching and all forms of queuing is inventory. It's waiting as well, but it's also inventory. It's all waste. Over processing, well, we have to look at the workload balancing on a board. So when you visualize workload, there's a Japanese word, hijunka, and it just means workflow leveling. And the concept of one-piece flow is that there are no queues, there are no batches, there's no inventory. Work is flowing continuously, and that's the sort of concept of flow in a lean context. So the idea is to balance the capacity in each of these different functions so that the flow is effectively flat. You've got no peaks and troughs there. That's the idea of work in progress limits. And then and here's an example where I've done it for identifying bottlenecks in a system, which is, waiting for legal, which is normal, waiting for partners, outsourced companies, and of course waiting for the big boss to sign off. Now, what have I got after that? Now let's get rid of that. So one of the key concepts here is to identify the waste in the system and eliminate it. And all Kanban will teach you is this, and a little bit about cycle time, tack time, and lead time. And they're very, very easy things to, if you go and read my articles on LinkedIn, you'll read those very, very quickly. What else have I got in here? There's a famous quote from Drucker. There is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. So just becoming uber super duper efficient doesn't mean you're producing any value. And this is one of the misnomers people have to start thinking when you start, oh, we're agile and we're doing Scrum and we're all lean and everything. Yeah. But there's nothing so useless as being efficient at stuff you shouldn't do at all. Now, the point of the question about organizations, if you learn to do this, if you learn these techniques, value stream mapping, and then so what I do is I start off by doing a value stream map, and I just use very simple things, post-it notes on a wall and a bunch of arrows going in a bunch of different directions to figure out the process of how work gets done, because there is another slide that I'll show you. Let me just stop that share a second. And I'll just open up this other slide, because and again, these are things I will share with you afterwards, because yeah, this is the one here. I had a few that I do a lot of drawings, and I did a drawing. I had a version of a pretty well-known drawing redrawn for me, so I'll send you the visual if it's useful to you, and I'll just let me share this for you. I'm sorry it takes a few seconds. So there's this concept of work as imagined versus work as done, and not many of you have seen similar visuals to this in the past. The whole purpose of what people call a Kanban board is to make visible work as done versus work as imagined. So the whole purpose of value stream mapping is to reveal how we get stuff done versus how we imagine, because your boss will say, do some stuff. And whether you're doing Scrum or plain old project management or something else in the middle, the perception of executives, leaders, and managers, and trust me, I've worked with many of them, about how you actually get stuff done is very much different to how stuff actually gets done. So by doing the value stream mapping, you're making visible how work gets done. And then by visualizing the steps in that process that you've now mapped on what people call a Kanban board, you start to show where the bottlenecks are, the constraints in the system are, and where the focus for Kaizen improvement needs to happen. So a massive, massive, massive part of becoming agile is what I've just described, doing the things I've just mentioned. If you do this, and this is what we did in Toyota, to come back to the original point, I sometimes go wandering off here, but to come back to the original point, is once we started to make how value streams visible, how stuff gets done, you actually started then to focus on fixing the things that were stopping teams getting work completed. Doing Scrum won't make you agile. Doing Scrum is a planning technique. It's described by Ken Schwaber as a planning cadence. So it's actually, and if you look at each of the events in Scrum and even the activity of backlog refinement, you are planning. You are continuously planning. You're on a continuous planning cadence. The daily Scrum is a planning meeting. It says so in the Scrum guide now. They've changed the language in there. So you're continuously planning how to get work done. The team formation is an agile construct where you bring together people with all the skills that can work together in close quarters, so you're not handing work off to different teams. This concept of having an external testing or QA team, and QA doesn't really exist, by the way, but this concept of a QA or a QC team is a misnomer because you're handing off, so you're removing the capability to test continuously. So if you come back to lean thinking, the whole concept of multi-skilled teams, you look at lean cells on a production line, and you've got all the materials you need, I mean, literally around you in the shape of a U, hence it's called a U cell. And you have multi-skilled teams, usually no bigger than about 4 or 5 people, maximum of 8, working on the production line. They got all the tools, all the knowledge, all the training, all the skills, and they're cross-skilled to help each other out and continuously rotate during a shift to stop repetitive strain injury and other things of that nature. And they're working together to accomplish the work. All we've done is taken that concept into agility and sort of built it around the same thing. All the tools with all the people, all the things we need to do the work in close proximity, so we're not doing all this excess motion and handing off. Once you start to visualize the work and actually put it on a board, so it's actually physically visible. And if you're using Jira or some other tool of demonic possession, please put it on a big television screen. These tools have the capability built in, so whether you're using version 1 or Rally, they're all evil tools designed by Beelzebub himself. But as you put all these things on, I hate them, by the way, but as you notice, but if you put them all on big screens, then you can see where the work is, and suddenly work as imagined becomes visible and work as done. Now you can engage in the conversation. Let me go back to here. Now you can engage in the conversation with leadership about how you need to fix things to become more agile. Because remember, the concept of agility isn't doing Scrum. The concept of agility is building the right thing in a just-in-time fashion by delivering the right value at the right point for the right person in just the quantity desired. That's the whole concept of agility, and that emerges because you're able to fix the things in the system that prevent that. I'm going to be quiet now because that was a really long answer to a simple question.
Yeah, I think it makes sense if we can start to influence our environment. We can gradually pass that kind of working and these kind of behaviors to the next environment until we can reach, if possible, the entire organization.
So how about, does anybody want to learn a little bit about what's behind me, this sort of flow system concept? I know 1 or 2 people came in. Yeah, good. Let me try and give you some, I'll put one slide up. I know it's easier with a visual, so let me just sort of get the right slide up. I have created thousands of visuals over time, so I have to navigate these a little bit, but let me just put the whole flow system picture on the board on the see if I got the big picture so I can show it. It looks a bit easier with that bigger thing. So let's put this on the screen for you all. Navigation, here we go. Do that, and I'll move this out of the way here, hit this button here. Okay, so let me try and talk a little bit about this. I'll give credit to my co-authors, so Professor John Turner from the University of North Texas, who heads up sort of team science and complexity thinking at the University of North Texas. And I'm very honored to be an advisor on a couple of boards there. I'm woefully unqualified to be an advisor on a university board, but you know, hey, they like some industry people to be involved, so it gives me a bit of kudos. And then you've got Punch, who's a captain in the US Navy Reserves. Punch and I have worked together both with Jeff Sutherland, and he worked with me at Toyota and other organizations. Punch brings in his deep knowledge of high performance teaming, high reliability organizations from his military background as a carrier aviation pilot. He flew F-14s in the US Navy. And he still works now with the Pentagon and with people at Norfolk, Virginia on lots of things that are super duper secret. So he never tells me anything. So these were my co-collaborators. And I wanted to sort of bring together, I'd sort of worked in this lean world for years, and I'd worked in this agile world for a while, and I started to think there was something missing here. And we got and as you see today in all these different factions we've got the Kanban folks, we've got the Scrum folks, the Safe folks, and I bash them all a bit playfully at times, and my talk this morning sort of highlighted the 270 certifications you can get in all that nonsense, and that doesn't even include the Lean Six Sigma world and all the rainbow colored belts you can get from a variety of different things. And my advice is don't waste your money on that. If somebody wants a certificate for a job, go get it, but other than that, you can learn a lot more by doing and participating in events like this. And so what I realized, actually, it wasn't this versus that versus the other. It was all of them together, or none of them at all. And so the way I describe this, there are many methods, tools, techniques, approaches, but it's context that determines the utility. So if you're working in manufacturing, the techniques you will use, as Joe Justice pointed out this morning, will be very different than if you're working in healthcare. And if you're in an operating room, as we say in the UK, an operating theatre, and when I say that in American, nobody knows what I mean, but when you're working in an operating room, if you were doing Scrum, people are going to die. This sort of idea of, this rapid iterative cycles in the operating room is probably not the best thing we want to put into the operating room. We have a certain plan and we're going to execute that plan. Yes, if we detect things on the way, emergent learning, we're going to use that rapid feedback to focus, but we're not going to start having daily scrums and backlog refinement in the operating room. It's just not the thing you're going to do. So your context determines the utility of the tools that you're going to use, and all of them have value, and all of them are valuable in the right context. So I started to realize that, number one, I needed to bring all this stuff together, and I drew a lot of early pictures before this emerged, and it's in this sort of housey shape because I was a Toyota guy and everything in Toyota was drawn like a house. TPS, the Toyota way. But it's not a temple. You're not meant to worship at it. And those are not pillars, they're helixes, and they're drawn in a way to represent something called a triple helix, which sort of emerged during the work we were doing on this. One of the guys who worked for me at the time, Dan Ufchinik, great guy, fantastic enterprise coach. When we were drawing the squiggly lines, he says, I like your DNA. And I said, that was it. And that's where it became the DNA of organizations of this triple helix. And the idea is to show that it is actually not these individual things that matter. It's the interconnections and the interconnected and intertwined nature of these different topics, which are the actual valuable elements. So we started to focus in three key areas: complexity thinking. So the work of people like my friend Dave Snowden and others in the complexity thinking world. We looked at leadership and the new patterns in distributed leadership. So a lot of the work that had been done by a variety of really eminent professors on leadership models. And then we started to look at the work of team science, and I listened a lot to what had gone off in the US military, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in a report that was being prepared for the US Navy about the challenges and accidents at sea. And I had some very high-ranking military people visit me on a number of occasions to add context from the team working side. So we started with our base of Toyota's production system. Really, it was my foundational lean thinking, systems thinking there, which formed our foundation. And as I say, some of the system thinkers argue that TPS isn't a system, but that's a discussion for another day. The Toyota way, this word mindset and philosophy, I've thought about changing those subsequently, but essentially it was, we're focused on a continuous improvement sort of focus with this respect for people. And Toyota way has been described by Toyota as really TPS for people who don't understand manufacturing. It really is the values and principles, and it's actually described in the official literature as the values and principles of the organization. So it was just to show a foundation of this. And when we first developed this, I was still working at Toyota, so there was a lot of Toyota influence. And then, excuse me, we started to look at the aspects of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science, and start to think what was necessary and relevant. And the difference between complex problems and problems sometimes defined in the complicated world, I'm not going to try and give you a lesson in Cynefin right now or in complexity theory, but essentially a complex problem cannot be solved using a reductionist technique. In simple language, you can't use A3 problem solving, otherwise known as Toyota business practice, to solve a complex problem. A complex problem is not reducible. And what I mean by reducible, when you do 5 why analysis, you start with a big thing and you ask why, and you keep going down, and you're reducing it down to its single root cause. That's a reducible problem solving approach. That does not work in complex problems, climate change, the pandemic, these types of things. There's no single root cause to bring things under control. And root cause analysis is about finding a single root cause. So when you eliminate it, the problem will never occur again. So complexity thinking took people beyond simple systems thinking, linear systems thinking, reducible problem solving, and introduced a number of techniques in there. 2 of them I've talked about a lot more recently, which is sense making and weak signal detection. Weak signal detection is, how do you know what you need to know before you need to know it? So one of the things like the pandemic, if I said to any company, hey, if I told you 12 months ago this was going to happen, what would you have done differently? So there are many things that we can take in from our extended networks. I was chatting in one of the Slack channels about network analysis and exploiting our extended networks, using sense-making techniques, and I'm planning some workshops on this in the near future, is how do we make sense of our environment? How do we gain situational awareness, which is also in the team science helix? And how do we consume all that information to make sense of our environment, but also to detect those weak signals? So how do you know when the market's going to change? How do you know when your products need to take a different direction? How do you know when, how do you find out in advance when customer demand is going to change? These are all aspects of complexity theory and complexity thinking. Then, of course, areas like storytelling and narratives, what we found, and a lot of people are starting to talk about, is that actually storytelling, when we have conversations and tell our stories, or we create small narratives, they're actually much more powerful in understanding the world around us than some of the current techniques we've been using. When we talk a little bit about enabling versus inhibiting constraints, an enabling constraint is one of the keys to empowerment. So an enabling constraint is basically guardrails, guidelines, you know, the boundaries. Like I have a slide sometimes I use like a bowling alley, where you bring up the sides on a bowling alley so the ball doesn't drop in the gully. When you're playing with kids, that's something you bring up to give them those guardrails so they can have an enjoyable game. So we talk about constraint management, which is about managing those constraints so people are free to free to move and evolve within those constraints, rather than inhibiting them with more and more bureaucracy and red tape and regulation, etc. So this is where really complexity thinking fits. Scrum fits in there. Scrum is a technique to work in this complex world, a planning technique. The OODA loop, if you have a military background, the OODA loop is a way of thinking. And again, it would take me too long to go into that now. But then we started, and then I put leadership in the middle, because even though this is not meant to be a temple, if I yank leadership out of any system, it collapses. And what we found, and for those that know a little bit about the Cynefin framework from Dave Snowden, we've got this quadrant. So quadrant will kill me for calling it a quadrant. This domain, this habitat called chaos, and see Ellen laughing at me. So don't tell him. So the thing is this: if you're in chaos, you actually need command and control leadership. You need somebody to take charge and tell you what to do. Because the phrase he uses there is act, sense, and respond. You're in chaos and, you know, the ship's sinking, you're drowning, something bad's happening. You need to be told what to do. You need to respond quickly, and you need people to step up and do that. And actually that works really, really well. When you're in a complex domain, of course, some of the tools I mentioned, like sense making, storytelling, narratives, help us to understand how to proceed forward. And there are many other techniques in there I can't cover now. But the leadership side is critically important. But distributed leadership changes the paradigm. It changes the model of leadership, because this actually retains centralized coordination, but with distributed decision making. So distributed leadership is very simply centralized coordination with distributed decision making. And a colleague of mine, Jay Bloom from Red Hat, was saying the other day, and I mentioned this in a previous conversation, was talking about CEOs or the C-suite shouldn't be making strategic decisions. Those people closer to the work should be making strategic decisions, because they understand what is needed better typically than the people at the top of the organization. And I can tell you, in a company like Toyota, Akio may have a general vision of the direction he wants to take the organization in, more electric, more environmentally friendly vehicles, transportational mobility as a company focus, as opposed to just building cars. But it's actually people closer to the products that understand what the product should have in them. And so that decision making authority is transferred to the people closer to the customer, closer to the product. So when we start to look at distributed leadership, of course, we are looking at work around psychological safety. And I've noticed, we've been talking about it for a couple of years, but I've noticed now in the last 3 or 4 months, every agile coach worth their salt is now on a webinar talking psychological safety, as if it's this big revelation they've come across. Yeah. And so Amy Edmondson is the famous professor in Harvard who popularized the phrase. She created the phrase, and her book, The Fearless Organization, has started to resonate a lot across business, and I highly recommend it. But psych safety is just making it safe to fail, making an environment where you're not punished. And one of the speakers this morning about agile metrics said, and I commented in Slack, that very powerful thing that once you use metrics to punish people, they'll never tell you the truth ever again. And I'm going to show something a little bit in a few minutes for Lindy before I forget, which is the self-guided correction and the behavioral markers, which I think are incredibly important to help you in that journey about how you measure things. Active listening, that's listening to understand and actually being able to repeat back what you've heard without criticism or judgment. Leader's intent comes from David Marquette's commander's intent. So we rephrased it because we didn't like the word commander in business, but leader's intent is really by this trust relationship being built between leadership and the people delivering the value. So leaders give intent of what they need and what they require. You give intent that you've understood it and you know how to deliver that. And you work much more in this trust-based relationship than you do in this sort of I say, you do relationship. There are 2 pillars, as Dave Marquette says, of that: competency and clarity. The people doing the work need the competence. They've got to have the skills. You've got to invest in continuous learning, on-the-job development, a continuous learning organization. And they need clarity, which is, I need to know how to make the right decision. I need to make ethical decisions, the right decisions for the customer, the organization, etc. And if you have these 2 things at a sufficient level, you can give control. And he says you move the authority to where the information is. You move the decision-making to where the work is being carried out. That's the basis of leaders' intent. And that helps us develop things like shared mental models, shared cognitions, and that's more in the team side than the shared cognitions. Wardley mapping, go Google Simon Wardley, look at his Wardley mapping technique. I'm going to be running a workshop on that, I think, the next couple of weeks for an organization, a public thing. But Wardley mapping helps you. It's the best portfolio prioritization technique you'll ever teach in management leadership. It's visual. It's really easy to use. It's called Wardley mapping. Let me just see if I can kill that down for a second. And oh, my machine runs slowly. Give me that a second.
While you do that, can you field questions about Wardley mapping? Because I'm quite interested.
Yeah, all right. I'll do that for you because I love you. I love you dearly. So I will do that for you if you give me a second. And let me just pull that up in here for you. It's in here in the right section. So, all right, I'll give you a quick Wardley mapping lesson. Somebody told me I got 20 minutes to finish a few minutes ago. That's okay. So I've got a good thing. I want to give you as much value as I possibly can. So let's talk about Wardley maps. Let's put this on full screen. So Simon Wardley, another Brit. It seems the Brits are really good at doing things. Sorry. So he came up with something. So here's what my friend Ponch put together in a couple of slides. Why use a map? Well, think about this. Imagine you're going out for the day in some place you're visiting. You got 20 points of interest. So you want to go to 20, there's 20 points of interest possibly available to you. So within that, there's 5 national landmarks and there's 5 places you might fancy to eat. So we want to get fed. Number of possible routes is 435 routes or routes if you're American. And then you could start to write some descriptions down. And if I asked you to describe a route in less than 25 words, it might look something like, you know, turn right at the Parliament building, turn left at the second XYZ. So if we take 435 routes and multiply that by 25 word descriptions, you end up with nearly 11,000 words to describe the directions for these small points of interest. So using a map is actually extremely valuable. So assuming you've got the basic idea of a Wardley map is to create a landscape like a visual map to save you having to write thousands of words, because you can go write these giant requirements documents. And even in the Agile world, trust me, you're going to have some business cases and something to justify multi-million dollars worth of funding when you go in asking for it. So the idea is that we can visualize on a landscape the value of what we want to produce. Now, a value chain, the concept of a value chain sort of shows about customer needs. So when I'm talking about value streams earlier, so you've got a customer need, and then you've got a bunch of different components and pieces that some are close to the customer, some are further away from the customer, and you go all the way back to utilities like power. And then you've got the evolution of an idea, whereas let me just go back one, sorry. I'm just gonna move this panel out of the way so I can see my own screen. And then you've got something that the evolution of a product, which starts in Genesis, that's a sort of new idea, back of a cigarette pack or back of a napkin, thrown at a wall. And then you've got this idea of custom build, where you build it internally with your own people, or you can take it, you can buy an off-the-shelf product like Salesforce or Oracle or something like that, which you then customize the off-the-shelf product. Or then you've got things like commodities, like, you know, the cellular phone system or electricity or something of that nature. And few of us are going to go out and build our own telephone network. We're just going to rent the utility. So the idea is to be able to take both of these things and combine them on a single map. And that's what Simon came up with. So a value chain may look something like this. To give you some sort of example, the evolution of this, you've got in the Genesis area, you've got the basic functionality that's been sort of scratched in-house about how things are going to work. In custom built, you may have the database and the user interface. Product rental, this is the stuff you'll outsource. Payments, so payment engines like payment gateways, where you do your credit card processing, your website hosting, maybe your customer resource management, Salesforce, that type of thing. Maybe you're hosting it on Amazon's web services in Kubernetes containers or something, so your platform services, and things like data centers, data processing. A lot of the big data processing now is you can outsource that to serverless-based systems in the cloud. Pay a lot of money for it, but you can. And then, of course, utility, the electricity. So this is the basic idea of how this map works. I'm going to skip through a couple of these, and I want to give you the example. No, come on, get out of the way. There's too many slides in here. Let me just give you the example I wanted to give you, which is... this is the one I give you. I'll show you how this works, because I don't want to give you the full training course in this short session because of time and questions. But Here's a real case study from a large automotive finance company who I couldn't possibly mention. But basically, we were working with them, and they had 17, I couldn't fit them all on the screen on this slide, 17 major initiatives representing about the work of about 1,600 developers and something in the region of about $100 million of annual investment. So we're not talking small fry here, we're talking a big chunk of money. And so we got all these initiatives, and we talked about customers earlier, and I never did give you the answer. Customers are your source of income. Customers are the people who pay you for your services or are recipients of your services, as opposed to shareholders, stakeholders, and users, which are all different things. And we can talk about that if it's relevant later. So basically, we put these 17, well, in this case, 15, because I couldn't get them all on the slide, initiatives on a wall, worked with the executives over a couple of hours, and they created a map. Now, I'm sorry, there's a bit of an animation here. It'll probably take a few seconds to catch up. What you actually found when we did this is that you looked at these initiatives. So on the vertical plane, X, the Y-axis, we're looking at the customer visibility. So the customers and the users of a system, because we do have internal users, of course, and customers are our external consumers of our products and services. We're looking at the initiatives that are closest to the customer. What's visible to the customer? What's valuable to the customer? And what we found was actually with a very little out of all those initiatives, very few of them were actually valuable to the customer at all, or even the internal users. And then what we found is that out of all those systems that we were building in-house, only 5 of them needed to be built in-house. The rest should be outsourced or purchased in or rented as utility. So we got 1,600 developers sinking a massive amount of cash into a bunch of initiatives we shouldn't even be working on. But nobody had ever viewed it in this plane. So what Wardley mapping enables you to do is to take these initiatives, and you can break them into smaller chunks and map them on this map. So across the horizontal plane, the x-axis, you've got the where it's the build it or buy it question. Should we be doing this in-house? Should we be buying it in, or should we just be renting it as a utility? And you see a lot of those initiatives were actually in the utility space. We could just rent them as a service. XYZ as a service. We've got product rental in the middle, which is where we could go and buy things like Salesforce. And indeed, we were using Salesforce and another custom off-the-shelf products, or COTS products, as they're often referred to. So that's the COTS area. And then customer built is where we're actually using our own developers and our own skills, knowledge, and capabilities to build the products. And then finally, the Genesis area, which is your research and development, it's your pilots, your proof of concepts, your other types of things that we need to be done. This transformed the prioritization of the entire organization. They changed their priority and their focus for the entire organization based upon this particular type of technique. I'm going to stop at that point because that really was more than I intended to do on Wardley mapping. But I hope that was useful at least to a couple of people on the basic concept. Go watch Simon Wardley's keynote on YouTube. It's about 50 minutes. It explains it far better than I do without doing a full training course. I have some class exercises on it. Time-wise, we are close to, we've got about 8 minutes or so left. I want to make sure that I'm getting to any other questions because I sort of diverted from the distributed leadership and missed off the team science piece of the flow system. Any questions or feedback from any of you so far?
Yeah, so my question about Wardley mapping was, it seems very good if you are talking about the level of a company and you're looking at the landscape to decide what you're going to do as your holistic strategy. But I hardly ever have that much scope in my hands. I usually am talking about one product that's been decided. I would love to apply it to that product, but every time I tried, I ended up with some loose ends and couldn't really build it up. Am I right? And it doesn't work in this size, or is that something that you can do?
So, sort of yes and no. I mean, it's a sort of yes and no thing. you could take a product and break a product down into smaller component pieces, features, functions, capabilities. Then you could sort of say, well, which are in this sort of land of proof of concept, we've got no idea, let's just go do some technical spikes or some whatever R&D, whatever you call your R&D and your playthings. Then you could sort of say, well, this is the stuff we definitely have to build in-house because there's no capability we can leverage for that. There's no API or anything else we can bring in, so let's do that. Then you've got the rental or the cot space. Are there products out there we can buy in, like we can bring in a product with some APIs and just hook into those APIs with some features we can build ourselves, some microservices, and use that? Or is there a product with some microservices built in we can hook and leverage? Or is this something that, I mean, the utility thing probably is not going to be, unless you're talking about electricity and cables and things of that nature. So yes, you could, but then as you say, there may be things that don't really, well, think about it, they should fit in one of those four categories. You're either going to go and figure out how to create, some new thing nobody's ever created before because there's nothing out there that's visible. You're going to develop something in-house because you can't quite get the capability you want. You're going to bring in a component or another software product or another system or another item and leverage that with your own custom development, or it's just going to be straightforward, rent it as a service from somebody else, a platform as a service, something as a service type thing. But it really isn't meant to be used. The utility of it isn't meant to be used at the sort of micro level of product development. That's your backlog and conversations with the customer as regards the prioritization. But if you have a departmental manager, a divisional manager, a vice president, and he or she has a budget of, 10 million shekels or dollars or euros or whatever it happens to be, then basically you can use it then to determine where that budget should be being spent. Because what happens a lot of the time, the budgets are decided to maintain a workforce level, the whole release train idea. We want to keep a level of capacity. But in the reality of it is we start to think of all these projects and initiatives as our people are going to do them all. Even if we're using outsourced partners, we still consider those as part of the workforce capacity. And so the idea of order mapping is to say, well, where should we prioritize from a customer value focus point of view? And there's essential internal things we have to do as well. But then where should we prioritize and focus our capacity to deliver that versus just buying something in? And that's a transformative conversation. And so I think you can use it at the sort of, if you want to use the old term, the program level, you're going to multitude of projects that form some sort of program level portfolio for a departmental manager, a general manager, a divisional VP or something, and have the conversation there. But when you get down to the product nuts and bolts, that's a conversation you should be having with the customer. Of course, most of us never do that. Most of us just do what the boss says, or the product owner that's really a manager telling us what we should do. But their conversation is probably for another day. Lorenzo, I don't know if that helps you at all.
That made me feel better. Well, actually worse, because then I cannot do anything about it. But at least I think I pushed it as far as I can in my current context.
All right, last 3 or 4 minutes. Any final comments, questions, thoughts? I know some people have put a few notes in the chat. Go ahead.
I have just a small question about the flow system, because it points to many different tools, which are very interesting. But did you work on how you use them together? How you make sense of using all of them together? Because the tools are nice.
Yes is the answer. It is not always appropriate to use all of the tools. It's not a giant toolbox. We just grab everything and learn to use it. This isn't meant to be like SAFe and these other things. This is basically what we think are the most important techniques, practices that we think you should learn. This is a system of learning and understanding. And actually, for your benefit, your colleagues, Dominique, the French guide is almost finished. I've just been sent the images to finish the translation on the French imagery for the version of the guide. The flow guide is free. It's online, flowguides.org. It's in 15 or 17 languages now. It's in some amazing languages. There's been some amazing translations done. In fact, Hugo translated the Portugal version, and the head of the Lean Institute, Christopher in Brazil, translated the Portuguese Brazilian version. The French version is almost completed. It's in Spanish and a bunch of other languages as well. But that starts to explain the concepts of how you should look to interconnect and intertwine these pieces. My key point for you to take away is that you need to have a deep understanding of lean thinking. If you're an agilist, if you're doing Agile and Scrum and things of this nature using Agile practices, you need this deep grounding in systems thinking and lean thinking. It's absolutely pivotal and key to it. But then to be able to deliver true value in this complex world we're living in, you need to start to understand some of the tools in complexity thinking, some of the complex facilitation methods like future backwards, ritual descent, some techniques in there. And then you need to start working with leadership. And this is more for organizational level, is they need to look at how they lead companies and how they foster collaboration. And that's where the distributed leadership comes in. So when we're talking about psych safety, active listening, leaders intent, these are behaviors, these are characteristics or stances, if you prefer, of people who manage and lead organizations and companies. And so it's incumbent upon some of us that are able to work at that level to educate organizations to help them transition to some of these types of techniques. But leadership also need to understand complex problems. It's no good just being a great leader if you don't understand complexity or lean thinking. And then the most important thing is team science. Team science is all about focused upon how we interact together, how we work together, how we collaborate together, how we communicate. There's a lot of things in the team science helix, and leadership need be teams. Most leadership teams I work with are the furthest thing from a team. They wouldn't know team if it jumped up and bit them on the backside. And when I work with them and I show them, I do an exercise with them in 12 minutes, which proves they're not a team, but they're a leadership team. And leadership is a totally different construct to what they actually are, which are executive managers. So leaders are people who demonstrate characteristics and behaviors that others will emulate, that are valuable to emulate. So leadership is a construct at the team level, at the individual level. It's individual behaviors. It's how you handle yourself, how you present yourself, how you interact with other people. That creates leadership. Then small teams become collective leadership. So you become a team of collective leaders. And then the team provides collective leadership for the organization. The organization starts taking cues and leadership decisions based upon the leadership of the teams in a multi-team system. And if you're an agile person, you look at agile scaling, you're just talking about multi-team systems and the human cognitions and behaviors between these different teams. Three key things. Teams don't know how to plan. They're clueless about how to plan. Even if you do Scrum, it doesn't teach you how to plan. There's a lot I've written on planning, and ping me afterwards if you want to learn a little bit more about effective planning. Effective communication. Teams don't know how to communicate. And you see this all the time when they're sitting around with the headphones on and there's very little communication going off. And you'll see some symptoms of that when you go to daily Scrum or daily stand-up. And that's the first time they're learning what each other's working on, because there's no communication within the team. And finally, based on Scott Tannenbaum's work, they don't know how to debrief. And as I mentioned in my talk this morning, a retrospective isn't about playing silly games and high-fiving each other. It's about debriefing the work that preceded the retrospective and focusing on how we're going to improve how we did the work, the process, going forward in the next sprint or the next iteration of work. And there are some methods using the storytelling and narratives from the complexity helix, which allows you to do real-time data capture during the sprint by capturing what happens when it happens as it's happening. So when you get to the retrospective, you're actually debriefing facts, not imagination about what happened, or direct or deflecting to go play some silly game. Games and team building, great. Go and play in escape rooms if you want to, but it won't actually improve Scrum, and it won't actually improve the way you do your work, because team building and team training has to be done in the context of the work you're working in as a team. So that was our very rapid on the team science side. We're sort of at time. I'm sure we're going to get kicked out of this session. Any last comments or questions before we say goodbye to everyone? Check out the flow.
I have a final question really quick. So when we were talking about my question, and we briefly mentioned Jira, you did a funny face. So what is your opinion about this kind of tools, and what do you suggest for us to use to do the management of the items that we have in our backlogs?
All tools are valuable and or in the right context. As I mentioned in my talk this morning, if you grab a hammer and start beating everything with it, you're going to cause a lot of damage.
Mm-hmm.
Jira, version 1, Rally, any of the others, Trello's owned by Jira, by the way, now, are all valuable if used appropriately, but the tool should serve you, not you serving the tool. I have when teams say to me things like, I can't do that, Jira won't let me, we now have a problem. So if Jira becomes the constraint, or the tool, doesn't matter what the tool is, the tool becomes the constraint,
okay,
eliminate the constraint or find a different way of working, because the tool shouldn't constrain the process. The tool should serve the process and actually enable you to do what you want to do. But don't lose the visualization aspect. It's so critical and crucial to be able to see. We are visual creatures. We work visually much better than we do in this sort of invisible world. I think we have to wrap it up. For those that remained, I'm deeply grateful to you all for coming. I'm deeply humbled by the time you spent with me this morning. I hope some of it's been useful. If you need anything more, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on social media. You can find me via flowguides.org. Just reach out to me and I'll share any of the material that was helpful to you. And we can always book some individual sessions and just have a chat. I do that for free, by the way. I won't charge you to have a chat. So I hope it's been useful, and I'll see all of you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Nigel. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Nigel.